Section 27 of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A. G. Carter. Section 27. Volume 2, Chapter 13. The Return to Framheim. Part 1. The going was splendid, and all were in good spirits, so we went along at a great pace. One would almost have thought the dogs knew they were homeward bound. A mild, summer-like wind with a temperature of -22° F was our last greeting from the Pole. When we came to our last camp, where the sledge was left, we stopped and took a few things with us. From this point we came into the line of beacons. Our tracks had already become very indistinct, but thanks to his excellent sight, Bjaaland kept in them quite well. The beacons, however, served their purpose so satisfactorily that the tracks were almost superfluous. Although these beacons were not more than about 3 feet high, they were extremely conspicuous on the level surface. When the sun was on them, they shone like electric lighthouses, and when the sun was on the other side, they looked so dark in the shadow that one would have taken them for black rocks. We intended in future to travel at night. The advantages of this were many and great. In the first place, we should have the sun behind us, which meant a good deal to our eyes. Going against the sun on a snow surface like this tells fearfully on the eyes, even if one has good snow goggles. But with the sun at one's back, it is only play. Another great advantage, which we did not reap till later, was that it gave us the warmest part of the 24 hours in the tent, during which time we had an opportunity of drying wet clothes and so on. This last advantage was, however, a doubtful one, as we shall see in due course. It was a great comfort to turn our backs to the south. The wind, which had nearly always been in this quarter, had often been very painful to our cracked faces. Now we should always have it at our backs, and it would help us on our way, besides giving our faces time to heal. Another thing we were longing for was to come down to the Barrier again, so that we could breathe freely. Up here we were seldom able to draw a good long breath. If we only had to say yes, we had to do it in 2 instalments. The asthmatic condition in which we found ourselves during our 6 weeks' stay on the plateau was anything but pleasant. We had fixed 15 geographical miles, 17 3/8 statute miles, as a suitable day's march on the homeward journey. We had, of course, many advantages now as compared with the southward journey, which would have enabled us to do longer marches than this, but we were afraid of overworking the dogs and possibly using them up before we had gone very far if we attempted too great a distance daily. It soon proved, however, that we had underestimated our dogs' powers. It only took us 5 hours to cover the appointed distance, and our rest was therefore a long one. On December the 19th we killed the first dog on the homeward trip. This was Lasse, my own favourite dog. He had worn himself out completely, and was no longer worth anything. He was divided into 15 portions, as nearly equal as possible, and given to his companions. They had now learnt to set great store by fresh meat, and it is certain that the extra feeds, like this one, that took place from time to time on the way home, had no small share in the remarkably successful result. They seemed to benefit by these meals of fresh meat for several days afterwards, and worked much more easily. December the 20th began with bitter weather, a breeze from the southeast, grey and thick. We lost the trail, and for some time had to go by compass. But as usual it suddenly cleared, and once more the plain lay before us, light and warm. Yes, too warm it was. We had to take off everything, nearly, and still the sweat poured off us. It was not for long that we were uncertain of the way. Our excellent beacons did us brilliant service, and one after another they came up on the horizon, flashed and shone, and drew us on to our all-important depot in 88° 25' south. We were now going slightly uphill, but so slight that it was unnoticeable. The hypsometer and barometer, however, were not to be deceived, and both fell in precisely the same degree as they had risen before. Even if we had not exactly noticed the rise, the feeling of it was present. It may perhaps be called imagination, but I certainly thought I could notice the rise by my breathing. Our appetite had increased alarmingly during the last few days. It appeared that we ski runners evinced a far greater voracity than the drivers. There were days, only a few days be it said, when I believe any of us three, Bjaaland, Hassel, and myself, would have swallowed pebbles without winking. The drivers never showed such signs of starvation. It has occurred to me that this may possibly have been due to their being able to lean on the sledges as they went along, and thus have a rest and support which we had to do without. It seems little enough simply to rest one's hand on a sledge on the march, but in the long run, day after day, it may perhaps make itself felt. Fortunately, we were so well supplied that when this sensation of hunger came over us, we could increase our daily rations. On leaving the Pole, we added to our pemmican ration, with the result that our wild beast appetites soon gave way and shrank to an ordinary, good, everyday twist. Our daily programme on entering upon the return journey was so arranged that we began to get breakfast ready at 6 p.m., and by 8 p.m. we were usually quite ready to start the day's march. An hour or so after midnight, the 15 geographical miles were accomplished, and we could once more put up our tent, cook our food, and seek our rest. But this rest soon became so insufferably long, and then there was the fearful heat, considering the circumstances, which often made us get out of our sleeping bags and lie with nothing over us. These rests of 12, 14, sometimes as much as 16 hours were what most tried our patience during the early part of the return journey. We could see so well that all this rest was unnecessary, but still we kept it up as long as we were on the high ground. Our conversation at this time used to turn very often on the best way of filling up these long, unnecessary waits. That day, December the 20th, Per, good, faithful, conscientious Per, broke down utterly and had to be taken on the sledge the last part of the way. On arrival at the camping ground he had his reward. A little blow of the back of the axe was enough for him. Without making a sound, the worn-out animal collapsed. In him Wisting lost one of his best dogs. He was a curious animal, always went about quietly and peaceably, and never took part in the others' battles. From his looks and behaviour one would have judged him, quite mistakenly, to be a queer sort of beast who was good for nothing. But when he was in harness, he showed what he could do. Without needing any shouts or cuts of the whip, he put himself into it from morning to night, and was priceless as a draught dog. But, like others of the same character, he could not keep it going any longer. He collapsed, was killed and eaten. Christmas Eve was rapidly approaching. For us it could not be particularly festive, but we should have to try to make as much of it as circumstances would permit. We ought, therefore, to reach our depot that evening, so as to keep Christmas with a dish of porridge. The night before Christmas Eve we slaughtered Svartflekken. There was no mourning on this occasion. Svartflekken was one of Hassel's dogs, and had always been a reprobate. I found the following in my diary, written the same evening. Slaughtered Svartflekken this evening. He would not do any more, though there was not much wrong with his looks. Bad character. If a man, he would have ended in penal servitude. He was comparatively fat, and was consumed with evident satisfaction. Christmas Eve came. The weather was rather changeable, now overcast, now clear, when we set out at 8 p.m. the night before. We had not far to go before reaching our depot. At 12 midnight we arrived there in the most glorious weather, calm and warm. Now we had the whole of Christmas Eve before us, and could enjoy it at our ease. Our depot was at once taken down and divided between the two sledges. All crumbs of biscuit were carefully collected by Wisting, the cook for the day, and put into a bag. This was taken into the tent and vigorously beaten and kneaded. The result was pulverized biscuit. With this product and a sausage of dried milk, Wisting succeeded in making a capital dish of Christmas porridge. I doubt whether anyone at home enjoyed his Christmas dinner so much as we did that morning in the tent. One of Bjaaland's cigars to follow brought a festival spirit over the whole camp. Another thing we had to rejoice about that day was that we had again reached the summit of the plateau, and after 2 or 3 more days' march would begin to go downhill, finally reaching the barrier and our old haunts. Our daily march had hitherto been interrupted by 1 or 2 halts; we stopped to rest both the dogs and ourselves. On Christmas Eve we instituted a new order of things, and did the whole distance, 15 geographical miles, without a stop. We liked this arrangement best after all, and it seemed as if the dogs did the same. As a rule, it was hard to begin the march again after the rest; one got rather stiff, lazy too, perhaps, and had to become supple again. On the 26th we passed 88° S, going well. The surface appeared to have been exposed to powerful sunshine since we left it, as it had become quite polished. Going over these polished levels was like crossing smooth ice, but with the important difference that here the dogs had a good foothold. This time we sighted high land even in 88°, and it had great surprises in store for us. It was clear that this was the same mighty range running to the southeast as we had seen before, but this time it stretched considerably farther to the south. The weather was radiantly clear, and we could see by the land that the range of vision was very great. Summit after summit the range extended to the southeast, until it gradually disappeared, but to judge from the atmosphere it was continued beyond our range of vision in the same direction. That this chain traverses the Antarctic continent I therefore consider beyond a doubt. Here we had a very good example of how deceptive the atmosphere is in these regions. On a day that appeared perfectly clear, we had lost sight of the mountains in 87°, and now we saw them as far as the eye could reach in 88°. That we were astonished is a mild expression. We looked and looked, entirely unable to recognize our position. Little did we guess that the huge mountain mass that stood up so high and clear on the horizon was Mount Thorvald Nilsen. How utterly different it had looked in the misty air when we said good-bye to it. It is amusing to read my diary of this time and see how persistently we took the bearings of land every day and thought it was new. We did not recognize that vast mountain until Mount Helmer Hansen began to stick up out of the plain. On December the 28th we left the summit of the plateau and began the descent. Although the incline was not perceptible to the naked eye, its effect could easily be seen in the dogs. Wisting now used to sail on his sledge, and was thus able to keep up with Hansen. If anyone had seen the procession that came marching over the plateau at that time, he would hardly have thought we had been out for 70 days at a stretch, for we came at a swinging pace. We always had the wind at our backs, with sunshine and warmth the whole time. There was never a thought of using the whip now. The dogs were bursting with health, and tugged at their harness to get away. It was a hard time for our worthy forerunner, as he often had to spurt as much as he could to keep clear of Hansen's dogs. Wisting in full sail, with his dogs howling for joy, came close behind. Hassel had his work cut out to follow, and indeed I had the same. The surface was absolutely polished, and for long stretches at a time we could push ourselves along with our sticks. The dogs were completely changed since we had left the Pole. Strange as it may sound, it is nevertheless true that they were putting on flesh day by day, and getting quite fat. I believe it must have been feeding them on fresh meat and pemmican together that did this. We were able again to increase our ration of pemmican from December the 28th. The daily ration was 1 pound, 450 grams per man, and we could not manage more. At least, I think not. On December the 29th we went downhill more and more, and it was indeed tough work being a ski runner. The drivers stood so jauntily by the side of their sledges, letting themselves be carried over the plain at a phenomenal pace. The surface consisted of sastrugi, alternating with smooth stretches like ice. Heaven help me, how we ski runners had to struggle to keep up. It was all very well for Bjaaland; he had flown faster on even worse ground. But for Hassel and me it was different. I saw Hassel put out now an arm, now a leg, and make the most desperate efforts to keep on his feet. Fortunately, I could not see myself. If I had been able to, I am sure I should have been in fits of laughter. Early that day, Mount Helmer Hansen appeared. The ground now went in great undulations, a thing we had not noticed in the mist when we were going south. So high were these undulations that they suddenly hid the view from us. The first we saw of Mount Hansen was from the top of one of these big waves. It then looked like the top of a pressure hummock that was just sticking up above the surface. At first we did not understand at all what it was. It was not till the next day that we really grasped it, when the pointed blocks of ice covering the top of the mountain came into view. As I have said, it was only then that we made sure of being on the right course. All the rest of the land that we saw was so entirely strange to us. We recognized absolutely nothing. On the 30th we passed 87° south, and were thus rapidly nearing the Devil's Ballroom and glacier. The next day was brilliantly fine, temperature –2.2° Fahrenheit, with a good breeze right aft. To our great joy we got sight of the land around the butcher's shop. It was still a long way off, of course, but was miraged up in the warm, sunny air. We were extraordinarily lucky on our homeward trip. We escaped the Devil's Ballroom altogether. On January the 1st we ought, according to our reckoning, to reach the Devil's Glacier, and this held good. We could see it at a great distance. Huge hummocks and ice waves towered into the sky. But what astonished us was that between these disturbances and on the far side of them, we seemed to see an even, unbroken plain, entirely unaffected by the broken surface. Mounts Hassel, Wisting, and Bjaaland lay as we had left them. They were easy to recognize when we came a little nearer to them. Now Mount Helmer Hansen again towered high into the air. It flashed and sparkled like diamonds as it lay bathed in the rays of the morning sun. We assumed that we had come nearer to this range than when we were going south, and that this was the reason of our finding the ground so changed. When we were going south, it certainly looked impassable between us and the mountains, but who could tell? Perhaps in the middle of all the broken ground that we then saw, there was a good even stretch, and that we had now been lucky enough to stumble upon it. But it was once more the atmosphere that deceived us, as we found out on the following day, for instead of being nearer the range, we had come farther out from it, and this was the reason of our only getting a little strip of this undesirable glacier. We had our camp that evening in the middle of a big filled-up crevasse. We were a trifle anxious as to what kind of surface we should find farther on. That these few hummocks and old crevasses were all the glacier had to offer us this time was more than we dared to hope. But the second came and brought, thank God, no disappointment. With incredible luck we had slipped past all those ugly and dangerous places, and now, before we knew where we were, we found ourselves safe and sound on the plain below the glacier. The weather was not first rate when we started at 7 in the evening. It was fairly thick, and we could only just distinguish the top of Mount Bjaaland. This was bad, as we were now in the neighbourhood of our depot, and would have liked clear weather to find out where it lay. But instead of clearing as we hoped, it grew thicker and thicker, and when we had gone about 6 3/4 miles, it was so bad that we thought it best to stop and wait for a while. We had all the time been going on the erroneous assumption that we had come too far to the east, that is, too near the mountains, and under the circumstances, in the short gleams that had come from time to time, we had not been able to recognize the ground below the glacier. According to our idea, we were on the east of the depot. The bearings, which had been taken in thick air, and were now to guide us in this heavy mist, gave no result whatever. There was no depot to be seen. We had just swallowed the grateful warm pemmican when the sun suddenly showed itself. I don't think the camp was ever broken and the sledges packed in such a short time. From the moment we jumped out of our bags till the sledges were ready, it only took us 15 minutes, which is incredibly quick. "What on earth is that shining over there through the fog?" The question came from one of the lads. The mist had divided and was rolling away on both sides. In the western bank something big and white peeped through, along the ridge running north and south. Hurrah! It's Helland Hansen. Can't possibly be anything else. Our only landmark on the west. We all shouted with joy on meeting this old acquaintance. But in the direction of the depot the fog hung thick. We held a brief consultation, and agreed to let it go, to steer for the butcher's and put on the pace. We had food enough, anyhow. No sooner said than done, and we started off. It rapidly cleared, and then, on our way towards Helland Hansen, we found that we had come not too far to the east, but too far to the west. But to turn round and begin to search for our depot was not to our liking. Below Mount Helland Hansen we came up on a fairly high ridge. We had now gone our fixed distance, and so halted. Behind us, in the brightest, clearest weather, lay the glacier, as we had seen it for the first time on our way to the south, break after break, crevasse after crevasse. But in among all this nastiness there ran a white, unbroken line, the very path we had stood and looked at a few weeks back. And directly below that white stripe we knew, as sure as anything could be, that our depot lay. We stood there expressing our annoyance rather forcibly at the depot having escaped us so easily, and talking of how jolly it would have been to have picked up all our depots from the plain we had strewed them over. Dead tired as I felt that evening, I had not the least desire to go back the 15 miles that separated us from it. If anybody would like to make the trip, he shall have many thanks. They all wanted to make it, all as one man. There was no lack of volunteers in that company. I chose Hansen and Bjaaland. They took nearly everything off the sledge and went away with it empty. It was then 5 in the morning. At 3 in the afternoon they came back to the tent, Bjaaland running in front, Hansen driving the sledge. That was a notable feat, both for men and dogs. Hansen, Bjaaland, and that team had covered about 50 miles that day, at an average rate of 3 to 3½ miles an hour. They had found the depot without much search. Their greatest difficulty had been in the undulating surface. For long stretches at a time they were in the hollows between the waves, which shut in their view entirely. Ridge succeeded ridge endlessly. We had taken care that everything was ready for their return. Above all, great quantities of water. Water, water was the first thing, and generally the last, that was in request. When their thirst was a little quenched, great interest was shown in the pemmican. While these two were being well looked after, the depot they had brought in was divided between the two sledges, and in a short time all was ready for our departure. Meanwhile the weather had been getting finer and finer, and before us lay the mountains, sharp and clear. We thought we recognized Fridtjof Nansen and Don Pedro Christophersen, and took the bearings of them in case the fog should return. With most of us the ideas of day and night began to get rather mixed. 6 o'clock, someone would answer, when asked the time. Yes, in the morning, remarks the other. No, what are you talking about? Answers the first one again. It's evening, of course. The date was hopeless. It was a good thing if we remembered the year. Only when writing in our diaries and observation books did we come across such things as dates. While at work we had not the remotest idea of them. Splendid weather it was when we turned out on the morning of January the 3rd. We had now agreed to go as it suited us, and take no notice of day or night. For some time past we had all been sick of the long hours of rest, and wanted to break them up at any price. As I have said, the weather could not have been finer, brilliantly clear and a dead calm. The temperature of -2.2 degrees Fahrenheit felt altogether like summer in this bright, still air. Before we began our march, all unnecessary clothes were taken off and put on the sledges. It almost looked as if everything would be considered superfluous, and the costume in which we finally started would no doubt have been regarded as somewhat unseemly in our latitudes. We smiled and congratulated ourselves that at present no ladies had reached the Antarctic regions, or they might have objected to our extremely comfortable and serviceable costume. The high land now stood out still more sharply. It was very interesting to see in these conditions the country we had gone through on the southward trip in the thickest blizzard. We had then been going along the foot of this immense mountain chain without a suspicion of how near we were to it, or how colossal it was. The ground was fortunately quite undisturbed in this part. I say fortunately, as heaven knows what would have happened to us if we had been obliged to cross a crevassed surface in such weather as we then had. Perhaps we should have managed it, perhaps not. The journey before us was a stiff one, as the butchers lay 2,680 feet higher than the place where we were. We had been expecting to stumble upon one of our beacons before long, but this did not happen until we had gone 12½ miles. Then one of them suddenly came in sight and was greeted with joy. We knew well enough that we were on the right track. But an old acquaintance like this was very welcome all the same. The sun had evidently been at work up here while we were in the south, as some of the beacons were quite bent over, and great icicles told us clearly enough how powerful the sunshine had been. After a march of about 25 miles, we halted at the beacon we had built right under the hill, where we had been forced to stop by thick weather on November the 25th. January the 4th was one of the days to which we looked forward with anxiety, as we were then due at our depot at the butcher's and had to find it. This depot, which consisted of the finest fresh dog's flesh, was of immense importance to us. Not only had our animals got into the way of preferring this food to pemmican, but, what was of still greater importance, it had an extremely good effect on the dog's state of health. No doubt our pemmican was good enough, indeed it could not have been better, but a variation of diet is a great consideration, and seems, according to my experience, to mean even more to the dogs than to the men on a long journey like this. On former occasions I have seen dogs refuse pemmican, presumably because they were tired of it having no variety, and the result was that the dogs grew thin and weak, although we had food enough. The pemmican I am referring to on that occasion was made for human use, so that their distaste cannot have been due to the quality. It was 1:15 a.m. when we set out. We had not had a long sleep, but it was very important to avail ourselves of this fine, clear weather while it lasted. We knew by experience that up here in the neighbourhood of the butcher's the weather was not to be depended upon. From the outward journey we knew that the distance from the beacon where our camp was to the depot at the butcher's was 13½ miles. We had not put up more than 2 beacons on this stretch, but the ground was of such a nature that we thought we could not go wrong. That it was not so easy to find the way, in spite of the beacons, we were soon to discover. In the fine, clear weather, and with Hanssen's sharp eyes, we picked up both our beacons. Meanwhile, we were astonished at the appearance of the mountains. As I have already mentioned, we thought the weather was perfectly clear when we reached the butcher's for the first time on November the 20th. I then took a bearing from the tent of the way we had come up on the plateau between the mountains, and carefully recorded it. After passing our last beacon, when we were beginning to approach the butcher's, as we reckoned, we were greatly surprised at the aspect of our surroundings. Last time, on November the 20th, we had seen mountains on the west and north, but a long way off. Now the whole of that part of the horizon seemed to be filled with colossal mountain masses, which were right over us. What in the world was the meaning of this? Was it witchcraft? I'm sure I began to think so for a moment. I would readily have taken my most solemn oath that I had never seen that landscape before in my life. We had now gone the full distance, and according to the beacons we had passed, we ought to be on the spot. This was very strange. In the direction in which I had taken the bearing of our ascent, we now only saw the side of a perfectly unknown mountain sticking up from the plain. There could be absolutely no way down in that precipitous wall. Only on the northwest did the ground give the impression of allowing a descent. There a natural depression seemed to be formed, running down towards the Barrier, which we could see far, far away. We halted and discussed the situation. "Hullo!" Hansen suddenly exclaimed. "Somebody's been here before." "Yes," broke in Wisting. "I'm hanged if that isn't my broken ski that I stuck up by the depot." So it was Wisting's broken ski that brought us out of this unpleasant situation. It was a good thing he put it there, very thoughtful in any case. I now examined the place with the glasses, and by the side of a snow mound, which proved to be our depot, but might easily have escaped our notice, we could see the ski sticking up out of the snow. We cheerfully set our course for the spot, but did not reach it until we had gone 3 miles. There was rejoicing in our little band when we arrived and saw that what we had considered the most important point of our homeward journey had been reached. It was not so much for the sake of the food it contained that we considered it so necessary to find this spot, as for discovering the way down to the Barrier again. And now that we stood there, we recognized this necessity more than ever. For although we now knew from our bearings exactly where the descent lay, we could see nothing of it at all. The plateau there seemed to go right up to the mountain, without any opening towards the lower ground beyond, and yet the compass told us that such an opening must exist, and would take us down. The mountain on which we had thus walked all day on the outward journey, without knowing anything of it, was Mount Fridtjof Nansen. Yes, the difference in the light made a surprising alteration in the appearance of things. End of section 27. Of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Philippa Jevons. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen. Translation by A. G. Carter. Section 28. Volume 2, Chapter 13. The Return to Framheim. Part 2. The first thing we did on reaching the depot was to take out the dogs' carcasses that lay there and cut them into big lumps that were divided among the dogs. They looked rather surprised. They had not been accustomed to such rations. We threw 3 carcasses onto the sledges so as to have a little extra food for them on the way down. The butcher's was not a very friendly spot this time either. True, it was not the same awful weather as on our first visit, but it was blowing a fresh breeze with a temperature of -9.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which, after the heat of the last few days, seemed to go to one's marrow, and did not invite us to stay longer than was absolutely necessary. Therefore, as soon as we had finished feeding the dogs and putting our sledges in order, we set out. Although the ground had not given us the impression of sloping, we soon found out that it did so when we got under way. It was not only downhill, but the pace became so great that we had to stop and put brakes under the sledges. As we advanced, the apparently unbroken wall opened more and more, and showed us at last our old familiar ascent. There lay Mount Ole Engelstad, snow-clad and cold, as we saw it the first time. As we rounded it, we came onto the severe, steep slope where, on the way south, I had so much admired the work done by my companions and the dogs that day. But now I had an even better opportunity of seeing how steep this ascent really had been. Many were the brakes we had to put on before we could reduce the speed to a moderate pace, but even so we came down rapidly, and soon the first part of the descent lay behind us. So as not to be exposed to possible gusts from the plain, we went round Mount Engelstad and camped under the lee of it, well content with the day's work. The snow lay here as on our first visit, deep and loose, and it was difficult to find anything like a good place for the tent. We could soon feel that we had descended a couple of 1,000 feet and come down among the mountains. It was still, absolutely still, and the sun broiled us as on a day of high summer at home. I thought, too, that I could notice a difference in my breathing. It seemed to work much more easily and pleasantly. Perhaps it was only imagination. At 1 o'clock on the following morning we were out again. The sight that met our eyes that morning when we came out of the tent was one of those that will always live in our memories. The tent stood in the narrow gap between Fridtjof Nansen and Ole Engelstad. The sun, which now stood in the south, was completely hidden by the latter mountain, and our camp was thus in the deepest shadow, but right against us, on the other side, the Nansen mountain raised its splendid ice-clad summit high towards heaven, gleaming and sparkling in the rays of the midnight sun. The shining white passed gradually, very gradually, into pale blue, then deeper and deeper blue, until the shadow swallowed it up. But down below, right on the Heiberg Glacier, its ice-covered side was exposed. Dark and solemn the mountain mass stood out. Mount Engelstad lay in shadow, but on its summit rested a beautiful, light little cirrus cloud, red with an edge of gold. Down over its side, the blocks of ice lay scattered pell-mell. And farther down, on the east, rose Don Pedro Christophersen, partly in shadow, partly gleaming in the sun, a marvellously beautiful sight. And all was so still, one almost feared to disturb the incomparable splendour of the scene. We now knew the ground well enough to be able to go straight ahead without any detours. The huge avalanches were more frequent than on the outward journey. One mass of snow after another plunged down. Don Pedro was getting rid of his winter coat. The going was precisely the same, loose, fairly deep snow. We went quite easily over it, however, and it was all downhill. On the ridge where the descent to the glacier began, we halted to make our preparations. Brakes were put under the sledges, and our 2 ski sticks were fastened together to make one strong one. We should have been able to stop instantly if surprised by a crevasse as we were going. We ski runners went in front. The going was ideal here on the steep slope, just enough loose snow to give one good steering on ski. We went whizzing down, and it was not many minutes before we were on the Heiberg Glacier. For the drivers it was not quite such plain sailing. They followed our tracks, but had to be extremely careful on the steep fall. We camped that evening on the selfsame spot where we had had our tents on November the 18th, at about 3,100 feet above the sea. From here one could see the course of the Axel Heiberg Glacier right down to its junction with the Barrier. It looked fine and even, and we decided to follow it instead of climbing over the mountain as we had done on the way south. Perhaps the distance would be somewhat longer, but probably we should make a considerable saving of time. We had now agreed upon a new arrangement of our time. The long spells of rest were becoming almost unbearable. Another very important side of the question was that, by a reasonable arrangement, we should be able to save a lot of time and reach home several days sooner than we had reckoned. After a great deal of talk on one side and on the other, we agreed to arrange matters thus. We were to do our 15 geographical miles, or 28 kilometres, and then have a sleep of 6 hours, turn out again and do 15 miles more, and so on. In this way we should accomplish a very good average distance on our day's march. We kept to this arrangement for the rest of the journey, and thus saved a good many days. Our progress down the Heiberg Glacier did not encounter any obstructions. Only at the transition from the glacier to the Barrier were there a few crevasses that had to be circumvented. At 7 a.m. on January the 6th, we halted at the angle of land that forms the entrance to the Heiberg Glacier and thence extends northward. We had not yet recognized any of the land we lay under, but that was quite natural, as we now saw it from the opposite side. We knew, though, that we were not far away from our main depot, in 85 degrees 5 minutes south. On the afternoon of the same day, we were off again. From a little ridge we crossed immediately after starting, Bjaaland thought he could see the depot down on the Barrier, and it was not very long before we came in sight of Mount Betty and our way up. And now we could make sure with the glasses that it really was our depot that we saw, the same that Bjaaland thought he had seen before. We therefore set our course straight for it, and in a few minutes we were once more on the Barrier, January the 6th, 11 p.m., after a stay of 51 days on land. It was on November the 17th that we had begun the ascent. We reached the depot and found everything in order. The heat here must have been very powerful. Our lofty, solid depot was melted by the sun into a rather low mound of snow. The pemmican rations that had been exposed to the direct action of the sun's rays had assumed the strangest forms, and, of course, they had become rancid. We got the sledges ready at once, taking all the provisions out of the depot and loading them. We left behind some of the old clothes we had been wearing all the way from here to the Pole and back. When we had completed all this repacking and had everything ready, 2 of us went over to Mount Betty and collected as many different specimens of rock as we could lay our hands on. At the same time we built a great cairn and left there a can of 17 litres of paraffin, 2 packets of matches containing 20 boxes, and an account of our expedition. Possibly someone may find a use for these things in the future. We had to kill Frithjof, one of Bjaaland's dogs, at this camp. He had latterly been showing marked signs of shortness of breath, and finally this became so painful to the animal that we decided to put an end to him. Thus brave Frithjof ended his career. On cutting him open it appeared that his lungs were quite shriveled up. Nevertheless the remains disappeared pretty quickly into his companions' stomachs. What they had lost in quantity did not apparently affect their quality. Nigger, one of Hassel's dogs, had been destroyed on the way down from the plateau. We thus reached this point again with 12 dogs, as we had reckoned on doing, and left it with 11. I see in my diary the following remark: "The dogs looked just as well as when we left Framheim." On leaving the place a few hours later, we had provisions for 35 days on the sledges. Besides this, of course, we had a depot at every degree of latitude up to 80 degrees. It looked as though we had found our depot at the right moment, for when we came out to continue our journey, the whole Barrier was in a blizzard. A gale was blowing from the south, with the sky completely clouded over. Falling snow and drift united in a delightful dance, and made it difficult to see. The lucky thing was that now we had the wind with us, and thus escaped getting it all in our eyes, as we had been accustomed to. The big crevasse, which, as we knew, lay right across the line of our route, made us go very carefully. To avoid any risk, Bjaaland and Hassel, who went in advance, fastened an alpine rope between them. The snow was very deep and loose, and the going very heavy. Fortunately, we were warned in time of our approach to the expected cracks by the appearance of some bare ice ridges. These told us clearly enough that disturbances had taken place here, and that ever greater ones might be expected, probably near at hand. At that moment the thick curtain of cloud was torn asunder, and the sun pierced the whirling mass of snow. Instantly Hansen shouted, "Stop, Bjaaland!" He was just on the edge of the yawning crevasse. Bjaaland himself has splendid sight, but his excellent snow goggles, his own patent, entirely prevented his seeing. Well, Bjaaland would not have been in any serious danger if he had fallen into the crevasse, as he was roped to Hassel, but it would have been confoundedly unpleasant all the same. As I have said before, I assume that these great disturbances here mark the boundary between the Barrier and the land. This time, curiously enough, they seemed also to form a boundary between good and bad weather, for on the far side of them, to the north, the Barrier lay bathed in sunshine. On the south, the blizzard raged worse than ever. Mount Betty was the last to send us its farewell. South Victoria Land had gone into hiding and did not show itself again. As soon as we came into the sunshine, we ran upon one of our beacons. Our course lay straight towards it. That was not bad steering in the dark. At 9 p.m. we reached the depot in 85 degrees south. Now we could begin to be liberal with the dogs' food too. They had double pemmican rations, besides as many oatmeal biscuits as they would eat. We had such masses of biscuits now that we could positively throw them about. Of course, we might have left a large part of these provisions behind, but there was a great satisfaction in being so well supplied with food, and the dogs did not seem to mind the little extra weight in the least. As long as things went so capitally as they were going, that is, with men and dogs exactly keeping pace with one another, we could ask for nothing better. But the weather that had cheered us was not of long duration. Same beastly weather, my diary says of the next stage. The wind had shifted to the northwest, with overcast, thick weather, and very troublesome drifting snow. In spite of these unfavourable conditions, we passed beacon after beacon, and at the end of our march had picked up all the beacons we had erected on this distance of 17 miles and 3/8. But, as before, we owed this to Hansen's good eyes. On our way southward we had taken a good deal of seal meat, and had divided it among the depots we built on the Barrier in such a way that we were now able to eat fresh meat every day. This had not been done without an object. If we should be visited with scurvy, this fresh meat would be invaluable. As we were, sound and healthy as we had never been before, the seal beef was a pleasant distraction in our menu, nothing more. The temperature had risen greatly since we came down onto the Barrier, and kept steady at about +14 degrees Fahrenheit. We were so warm in our sleeping bags that we had to turn them with the hair out. That was better. We breathed more freely and felt happier. Just like going into an ice cellar, somebody remarked. The same feeling as when on a really warm summer day one comes out of the hot sun into cool shade. January the 9th. Same beastly weather. Snow, snow, snow. Nothing but snow. Is there no end to it? Thick, too, so that we have not been able to see 10 yards ahead. Temperature +17.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Thawing everywhere on the sledges. Everything getting wet. Have not found a single beacon in this blind man's weather. The snow was very deep to begin with, and the going exceedingly heavy, but in spite of this the dogs managed their sledges very well. That evening the weather improved, fortunately, and became comparatively clear by the time we resumed our journey at 10 p.m. Not long after, we sighted one of our beacons. It lay to the west, about 200 yards away. We were thus not far out of our course. We turned aside and went up to it, as it was interesting to see whether our reckoning was in order. The beacon was somewhat damaged by sunshine and storms, but we found the paper left in it, which told us that this beacon was erected on November the 14th, in 84 degrees 26 minutes south. It also told us what course to steer by compass to reach the next beacon, which lay 5 kilometres from this one. As we were leaving this old friend and setting our course as it advised, to our unspeakable astonishment, 2 great birds, skua gulls, suddenly came flying straight towards us. They circled round us once or twice, and then settled on the beacon. Can anyone who reads these lines form an idea of the effect this had upon us? It is hardly likely. They brought us a message from the living world into this realm of death, a message of all that was dear to us. I think the same thoughts filled us all. They did not allow themselves a long rest, these first messengers from another world. They sat still a while, no doubt wondering who we were, then rose aloft and flew on to the south. Mysterious creatures! They were now exactly halfway between Framheim and the pole, and yet they were going farther inland. Were they going over to the other side? Our march ended this time at one of our beacons, in 84 degrees 15 minutes. It felt so good and safe to lie beside one of these. It always gave us a sure starting point for the following stage. We were up at 4 a.m. and left the place a few hours later, with the result that the day's march brought us 34 miles nearer Framheim. With our present arrangement, we had these long day marches every other day. Our dogs need no better testimonial than this: one day 17 miles, the next day 34, and fresh all the way home. The 2 birds, agreeably as their first appearance had affected me, led my thoughts after a while in another direction, which was anything but agreeable. It occurred to me that these 2 might only be representatives of a larger collection of these voracious birds, and that the remainder might now be occupied in consuming all the fresh meat we had so laboriously transported with us and spread all over the plain in our depots. It is incredible what a flock of these birds of prey can get rid of. It would not matter if the meat were frozen as hard as iron. They would have managed it even if it had been a good deal harder than iron. Of the seals' carcasses we had lying in 80 degrees, I saw in my thoughts nothing but the bones. Of the various dogs we had killed on our way south and laid on the tops of beacons, I did not see even so much as that. Well, it was possible that my thoughts had begun to assume too dark a hue. Perhaps the reality would be brighter. Weather and going began by degrees to right themselves. It looked as if things would improve in proportion to our distance from land. Finally, both became perfect. The sun shone from a cloudless sky, and the sledges ran on the fine, even surface with all the ease and speed that could be desired. Bjaaland, who had occupied the position of forerunner all the way from the pole, performed his duties admirably. But the old saying that nobody is perfect applied even to him. None of us, no matter who it may be, can keep in a straight line when he has no marks to follow. All the more difficult is this when, as so often happened with us, one has to go blindly. Most of us, I suppose, would swerve now to one side, now to the other, and possibly end, after all this groping, by keeping pretty well to the line. Not so with Bjaaland. He was a right-hand man. I can see him now. Hansen has given him the direction by compass, and Bjaaland turns around, points his ski in the line indicated, and sets off with decision. His movements clearly show that he has made up his mind, cost what it may, to keep in the right direction. He sends his ski firmly along so that the snow spurts from them and looks straight before him. But the result is the same. If Hansen had let Bjaaland go on without any correction, in the course of an hour or so, the latter would probably have described a beautiful circle and brought himself back to the spot from which he had started. Perhaps, after all, this was not a fault to complain of, since we always knew with absolute certainty that when we had got out of the line of beacons, we were to the right of it, and had to search for the beacons to the west. This conclusion proved very useful to us more than once, and we gradually became so familiar with Bjaaland's right-handed tendencies that we actually counted on them. On January the 13th, according to our reckoning, we ought to reach the depot in 83° south. This was the last of our depots that was not marked at right angles to the route, and therefore the last critical point. The day was not altogether suited for finding the needle in the haystack. It was calm with a thick fog, so thick that we could only see a few yards in front of us. We did not see a single beacon the whole march. At 4 p.m. we had completed the distance, according to the sledge meters, and reckoned that we ought to be in 83° south, by the depot, but there was nothing to be seen. We decided therefore to set our tent and wait till it cleared. While we were at work with this, there was a rift in the thick mass of fog, and there, not many yards away, to the west of course, lay our depot. We quickly took the tent down again, packed it on the sledge, and drove up to our food mound, which proved to be quite in order. There was no sign of the birds having paid it a visit. But what was that? Fresh, well-marked dog tracks in the newly fallen snow. We soon saw that they must be the tracks of the runaways that we had lost here on the way south. Judging by appearances, they must have lain under the lee of the depot for a considerable time. 2 deep hollows in the snow told us that plainly. And evidently they must have had enough food, but where on earth had they got it from? The depot was absolutely untouched, in spite of the fact that the lumps of pemmican lay exposed to the light of day and were very easy to get at, besides which the snow on the depot was not so hard as to prevent the dogs pulling it down and eating up all the food. Meanwhile the dogs had left the place again, as shown by the fresh trail, which pointed to the north. We examined the tracks very closely and agreed that they were not more than 2 days old. They went northward, and we followed them from time to time on our next stage. At the beacon in 82° 45', where we halted, we saw them still going to the north. In 82° 24', the trail began to be much confused, and ended by pointing due west. That was the last we saw of the tracks, but we had not done with these dogs, or rather with their deeds. We stopped at the beacon in 82° 20'. Else, who had been laid on the top of it, had fallen down and lay by the side. The sun had thawed away the lower part of the beacon. So the roving dogs had not been here, so much was certain, for otherwise we should not have found Else as we did. We camped at the end of that stage by the beacon in 82° 15', and shared out Else's body. Although she had been lying in the strong sunshine, the flesh was quite good when we had scraped away a little mouldiness. It smelt rather old, perhaps, but our dogs were not fastidious when it was a question of meat. On January the 16th we arrived at the depot in 82° south. We could see from a long way off that the order in which we had left it no longer prevailed. When we came up to it we saw at once what had happened. The innumerable dog tracks that had trampled the snow quite hard round the depot declared plainly enough that the runaways had spent a good deal of time here. Several of the cases belonging to the depot had fallen down, presumably from the same cause as Else, and the rascals had succeeded in breaking into one of them. Of the biscuits and pemmican which it had contained, nothing, of course, was left, but that made no difference to us now, as we had food in abundance. The 2 dogs' carcasses that we had placed on top of the depot, Uranus and Yala, were gone. Not even the teeth were to be seen. Yet they had left the teeth of Lucy, whom they had eaten in 82° 3'. Yala's 8 puppies were still lying on the top of a case. Curiously enough, they had not fallen down. In addition to all the rest, the beasts had devoured some ski bindings and things of that sort. It was no loss to us as it happened, but who could tell which way these creatures had gone? If they had succeeded in finding the depot in 80° south, they would probably by this time have finished our supply of seal meat there. Of course it would be regrettable if this had happened, although it would entail no danger either to ourselves or our animals. If we got as far as 80°, we should come through all right. For the time being we had to console ourselves with the fact that we could see no continuation of the trail northward. We permitted ourselves a little feast here in 82°, The chocolate pudding that Wisting served as dessert is still fresh in my memory. We all agreed it came nearer perfection than anything it had hitherto fallen to our lot to taste. I may disclose the receipt. Biscuit crumbs, dried milk, and chocolate are put into a kettle of boiling water. What happens afterwards, I don't know. For further information, apply to Wisting. Between 82° and 81°, we came into our old marks of the second depot journey. On that trip we had marked this distance with splinters of packing case at every geographical mile. That was in March 1911, and now we were following these splinters in the second half of January 1912. Apparently they stood exactly as they had been put in. This marking stopped in 81° 33' south, with 2 pieces of case on a snow pedestal. The pedestal was still intact and good. I shall let my diary describe what we saw on January the 18th. Unusually fine weather today. Light south-southwest breeze, which in the course of our march cleared the whole sky. In 81° 20' we came abreast of our old big pressure ridges. We now saw far more of them than ever before. They extended as far as the eye could see, running northeast to southwest in ridges and peaks. Great was our surprise when, a short time after, we made out high, bare land in the same direction, and not long after that 2 lofty white summits to the southeast, probably in about 82° south. It could be seen by the look of the sky that the land extended from the northeast to southwest. This must be the same land that we saw lose itself in the horizon at about 84° south, when we stood at a height of about 4,000 feet and looked out over the Barrier during our ascent. We now have sufficient indications to enable us without hesitation to draw this land as continuous, Kármán land. The surface against the land is violently disturbed, crevasses and pressure ridges, waves and valleys in all directions. We shall no doubt feel the effect of it tomorrow. Although what we have seen apparently justifies us in concluding that Kármán land extends from 86° south to this position, about 81° 30' south, and possibly farther to the northeast, I have not ventured to lay it down thus on the map. I have contented myself with giving the name of Kármán land to the land between 86° and 84°, and have called the rest appearance of land. It will be a profitable task for an explorer to investigate this district more closely. As we had expected, on our next stage we were made to feel the effect of the disturbances. 3 times we had now gone over this stretch of the Barrier without having really clear weather. This time we had it, and were able to see what it actually looked like. The irregularities began in 81° 12' south, and did not extend very far from north to south, possibly about 5 kilometres, 3¼ miles. How far they extended from east to west is difficult to say, but at any rate as far as the eye could reach. Immense pieces of the surface had fallen away, and opened up the most horrible yawning gulfs, big enough to swallow many caravans the size of ours. From these open holes ugly wide cracks ran out in all directions, beside which mounds and haycocks were everywhere to be seen. Perhaps the most remarkable thing of all was that we had passed over here unharmed. We went across as light-footedly as possible and at top speed. Hanssen went half-way into a crevasse, but luckily got out of it again without difficulty. The depot in 81° south was in perfect order, no dog tracks to be seen there. Our hopes that the depot in 80° south would be intact rose considerably. In 80° 45' south lay the first dog we had killed, Bone. He was particularly fat and was immensely appreciated. The dogs no longer cared very much for pemmican. On January the 21st we passed our last beacon, which stood in 80° 23' south. Glad as we were to leave it behind, I cannot deny that it was with a certain feeling of melancholy that we saw it vanish. We had grown so fond of our beacons, and whenever we met them we greeted them as old friends. Many and great were the services these silent watchers did us on our long and lonely way. On the same day we reached our big depot in 80° south, and now we considered that we were back. We could see at once that others had been at the depot since we had left it, and we found a message from Lieutenant Prestrud, the leader of the Eastern Party, saying that he, with Stubberud and Johansen, had passed here on November the 12th, with 2 sledges, 16 dogs, and supplies for 30 days. Everything thus appeared to be in the best of order. Immediately on arriving at the depot we let the dogs loose, and they made a dash for the heap of seal's flesh, which had been attacked neither by birds nor dogs in our absence. It was not so much for the sake of eating that our dogs made their way to the meat mound, as for the sake of fighting. Now they really had something to fight about. They went round the seals' carcasses a few times, looked askance at the food and at each other, and then flung themselves into the wildest scrimmage. When this had been duly brought to a conclusion, they went away and lay round their sledges. The depot in 80° south is still large, well supplied, and well marked, so it is not impossible that it may be found useful later. The journey from 80° south to Framheim has been so often described that there is nothing new to say about it. On January the 25th, at 4 a.m., we reached our good little house again, with 2 sledges and 11 dogs, men and animals all hale and hearty. We stood and waited for each other outside the door in the early morning. Our appearance must be made all together. It was so still and quiet, they must be all asleep. We came in. Stubberud started up in his bunk and glared at us. No doubt he took us for ghosts. One after another they woke up, not grasping what was happening. Then there was a hearty welcome home on all sides. "Where's the Fram?" was of course our first question. Our joy was great when we heard all was well. "And what about the Pole? Have you been there?" "Yes, of course, otherwise you would hardly have seen us again." Then the coffee kettle was put on, and the perfume of hot cakes rose as in old days. We agreed that it was good outside, but still better at home. 99 days the trip had taken, distance about 1,860 miles. The Fram had come into the Barrier on January the 8th, after a 3 months' voyage from Buenos Aires. All were well on board. Meanwhile, bad weather had forced her to put out again. On the following day, the lookout man reported that the Fram was approaching. There was life in the camp. On with furs and out with the dogs. They should see that our dogs were not worn out yet. We heard the engine panting and grunting, saw the crow's nest appear over the edge of the Barrier, and at last she glided in, sure and steady. It was with a joyful heart I went on board and greeted all these gallant men who had brought the Fram to her destination through so many fatigues and perils, and had accomplished so much excellent work on the way. They all looked pleased and happy, but nobody asked about the Pole. At last it slipped out of Gjertsen. "Have you been there?" Joy is a poor name for the feeling that beamed in my comrades' faces. It was something more. I shut myself up in the chart house with Captain Nilsen, who gave me my mail and all the news. 3 names stood high above the rest when I was able to understand all that had happened, the names of the 3 who gave me their support when it was most needed. I shall always remember them in respectful gratitude. His Majesty the King, Professor Fridtjof Nansen, Don Pedro Christophersen. End of section 28. End of volume 2, chapter 13, The Return to Framheim.
Of the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The South Pole by Roald Amundsen, translation by A.G. Carter. Section 29, Volume 2, Chapter 14, Northward. After 2 days of bustle and getting on board the things we were to take with us, we managed to be ready for sea on the afternoon of January 30. There could scarcely have been anything at that moment that rejoiced us more than just the fact that we were able at so early a date to set our course northward, and thus take the first step on the way to that world which, as we knew, would soon begin to expect news from us or of us. And yet, I wonder whether there was not a little feeling of melancholy in the midst of all our joy. It can hardly be doubted that such was really the case, although to many this may seem a flat contradiction. But it is not altogether so easy to part from a place that has been one's home for any length of time, even though this home lie on the 79th degree of latitude, more or less buried in snow and ice. We human beings are far too dependent on habit to be able to tear ourselves abruptly from the surroundings with which we have been obliged to be familiar for many months. That outsiders would perhaps pray all the powers of goodness to preserve them from such surroundings does not counteract the full validity of this rule. To an overwhelming majority of our fellow men, Framheim would certainly appear as one of those spots on our planet where they would least of all wish to find themselves. A God-forsaken, out-of-the-way hole that could offer nothing but the very climax of desolation, discomfort, and boredom. To us 9 who stood on the gangway ready to leave this place, things appeared somewhat differently. That strong little house, that now lay entirely hidden beneath the snow behind Mount Nelson, had for a whole year been our home, and a thoroughly good and comfortable home it was, where after so many a hard day's work we had found all the rest and quiet we wanted. Through the whole Antarctic winter, and it is a winter, those 4 walls had protected us so well that many a poor wretch in milder latitudes would have envied us with all his heart if he could have seen us. In conditions so hard that every form of life flies headlong from them, we had lived on at Framheim undisturbed and untroubled, and lived, be it said, not as animals, but as civilized human beings, who had always within their reach most of the good things that are found in a well-ordered home. Darkness and cold reigned outside, and the blizzards no doubt did their best to blot out most traces of our activity. But these enemies never came within the door of our excellent dwelling. There we shared quarters with light and warmth and comfort. What wonder was it that this spot exercised a strong attraction upon each of us at the moment when we were to turn our backs on it for good? Outside, the great world beckoned to us, that is true, and it might have much to offer us that we had had to forego for a long time, but in what awaited us there was certainly a great deal that we would gladly have put off for as long as possible. When everyday life came with its cares and worries, it might well happen that we should look back with regret to our peaceful and untroubled existence at Framheim. However, this feeling of melancholy was hardly so strong that we could not all get over it comparatively quickly. Judging by the faces, at any rate, one would have thought that joy was the most predominant mood. And why not? It was no use dwelling on the past, however attractive it might seem just then, and as to the future, we had every right to expect the best of it. Who cared to think of coming troubles? No one. Therefore the Fram was dressed with flags from stem to stern, and therefore faces beamed at each other as we said good-bye to our home on the barrier. We could leave it with the consciousness that the object of our year's stay had been attained, and, after all, this consciousness was of considerably more weight than the thought that we had been so happy there. One thing that in the course of our 2 years' association on this expedition contributed enormously to making time pass easily and keeping each of us in full vigor was the entire absence of what I might call dead periods. As soon as one problem was solved, another instantly appeared. No sooner was one goal reached than the next one beckoned from afar. In this way we always had our hands full, and when that is the case, as everyone knows, time flies quickly. One often hears it asked, how is it possible to make the time pass on such a trip? "My good friends," I would answer, "if anything caused us worry, it was the thought of how we should find time enough for all we had to do." Perhaps to many this assertion will bear the stamp of improbability. It is, nevertheless, absolutely true. Those who have read this narrative through will, in any case, have received the impression that unemployment was an evil that was utterly unknown in our little community. At the stage where we now found ourselves, with the main object of our enterprise achieved, there might have been reason to expect a certain degree of relaxation of interest. This, however, was not the case. The fact was that what we had done would have no real value until it was brought to the knowledge of mankind, and this communication had to be made with as little loss of time as possible. If any one was interested in being first in the market, it was certainly ourselves. The probability was, no doubt, that we were out in good time, but in spite of it all, it was only a probability. On the other hand, it was absolutely certain that we had a voyage of 2,400 nautical miles to Hobart, which had been selected as our first port of call, and it was almost equally certain that this voyage would be both slow and troublesome. A year before, our trip through the Ross Sea had turned out almost like a pleasure cruise, but that was in the middle of summer. Now we were in February, and autumn was at hand. As regards the belt of drift ice, Captain Nilsen thought it would cause us no delay in the future. He had discovered a patent and infallible way of getting through. This sounded like a rather bold assertion, but as will be seen later, he was as good as his word. Our worst troubles would be up in the westerlies, where we should this time be exposed to the unpleasant possibility of having to beat. The difference in longitude between the Bay of Whales and Hobart is nearly 50 degrees. If we could have sailed off this distance in longitude in the latitudes where we were then, and where a degree of longitude is only about 13 nautical miles, it would all have been done in a twinkling. But the mighty mountain ranges of North Victoria Land were a decisive obstacle. We should first have to follow a northerly course until we had rounded the Antarctic continent's northern outpost, Cape Adare, and the Balleny Islands to the north of it. Not till then would the way be open for us to work to the west, but then we should be in a region where in all probability the wind would be dead against us, and as to tacking with the Fram, no thank you. Every single man on board knew enough of the conditions to be well aware of what awaited us, and it is equally certain that the thoughts of all were centered upon how we might conquer our coming difficulties in the best and quickest way. It was the one great common object that still bound, and would continue to bind, us together in our joint efforts. Among the items of news that we had just received from the outer world was the message that the Australian Antarctic expedition under Dr. Douglas Mawson would be glad to take over some of our dogs if we had any to spare. The base of this expedition was Hobart, and as far as that went, this suited us very well. It chanced that we were able to do our esteemed colleague this small service. On leaving the barrier, we could show a pack of 39 dogs, many of which had grown up during our year's stay there, about half which had survived the whole trip from Norway, and 11 had been at the South Pole. It had been our intention only to keep a suitable number of the progenitors of a new pack for the approaching voyage in the Arctic Ocean, but Dr. Mawson's request caused us to take all 39 on board. Of these dogs, if nothing unforeseen happened, we should be able to make over 21 to him. When the last load was brought down, there was nothing to do but pull the dogs over the side, and then we were ready. It was quite curious to see how several of the old veterans seemed at home again on the Fram's deck. Wisting's brave dog, the old colonel, and his two adjutants, Suggen and Arne, at once took possession of the places where they had stood for so many a long day on the voyage south, on the starboard side of the mainmasts. The two twins, Milas and Ring, Helmer Hansen's special favorites, began their games away in the corner of the foredeck to port as though nothing had happened. To look at these two merry rascals, no one would have thought they had trotted at the head of the whole caravan both to and from the pole. One solitary dog could be seen stalking about lonely and reserved in a continual uneasy search. This was the boss of Bjaaland's team. He was unaffected by any advances. No one could take the place of his fallen comrade and friend Frisjag, who had long ago found a grave in the stomachs of his companions many hundreds of miles across the barrier. No sooner was the last dog helped on board and the 2 ice anchors released than the engine room telegraph rang, and the engine was at once set going to keep us from any closer contact with the ice foot in the Bay of Whales. Our farewell to this snug harbor took almost the form of a leap from one world to another. The fog hung over us as thick as gruel, concealing all the surrounding outlines behind its clammy curtain as we stood out. After a lapse of 3 or 4 hours, it lifted quite suddenly, but astern of us the bank of fog still stood like a wall. Behind it the panorama, which we knew would have looked wonderful in clear weather, and which we should so gladly have let our eyes rest upon as long as we could, was entirely concealed. The same course we had steered when coming in a year before could safely be taken in the opposite direction now we were going out. The outlines of the bay had remained absolutely unchanged during the year that had elapsed. Even the most projecting point of the wall on the west side of the bay, Cape Man's Head, stood serenely in its old place, and it looked as if it was in no particular hurry to remove itself. It will probably stay where it is for many a long day yet, for if any movement of the ice mass is taking place at the inner end of the bay, it is in any case very slight. Only in one respect did the condition of things differ somewhat this year from the preceding. Whereas in 1911 the greater part of the bay was free of sea ice as early as January 14, in 1912 there was no opening until about 14 days later. The ice sheet had stubbornly held on until the fresh northeasterly breeze that appeared on the very day the southern party returned had rapidly provided a channel of open water. The breaking up of the ice could not possibly have taken place at a more convenient moment. The breeze in question saved us a great deal, both in time and trouble, as the way to the place where the Fram lay before the ice broke up was about 5 times as long as the distance we now had to go. This difference of 14 days, in the time of the disappearance of the ice in 2 summers, showed us how lucky we had been to choose that particular year, 1911, for our landing here. The work which we carried out in 3 weeks in 1911, thanks to the early breaking up of the ice, would certainly have taken us double the time in 1912, and would have caused us far more difficulty and trouble. The thick ice that, as I have said, lay over the Bay of Whales when we left it, prevented us also from seeing what our friends the Japanese were doing. The Kaiyanan Maru had put to sea in company with the Fram during the gale of January 27, and since that time we had seen nothing of them. Those members of the expedition who had been left behind in a tent on the edge of the barrier to the north of Framheim had also been very retiring of late. On the day we left the place, one of our own party had an interview with 2 of the foreigners. Prestrud had gone to fetch the flag that had been set up on Cape Man's Head as a signal to the Fram that all had returned. By the side of the flag a tent had been put up, which was intended as a shelter for a lookout man in case the Fram had been delayed. When Prestrud came up, he was no doubt rather surprised to find himself face to face with 2 sons of Nippon, who were engaged in inspecting our tent and its contents, which, however, only consisted of a sleeping bag and a primus. The Japanese had opened the conversation with enthusiastic phrases about "nice day" and "plenty ice," when our man had expressed his absolute agreement on these indisputable facts. He tried to get information on matters of more special interest. The two strangers told him that for the moment they were the only inhabitants of the tent out on the edge of the barrier. Two of their companions had gone on a tour into the barrier to make meteorological observations and were to be away about a week. The Kinian Maru had gone on another cruise in the direction of King Edward Land. As far as they knew, it was intended that the ship should be back before February 10th, and that all of the members of the expedition should then go on board and sail to the north. Prestrud had invited his two new acquaintances to visit us at Framheim, the sooner the better. They delayed their coming too long, however, for us to be able to wait for them. If they have since been at Framheim, they will at any rate be able to bear witness that we did our best to make things comfortable for any successors. When the fog lifted, we found ourselves surrounded by open sea, practically free from ice on all sides. A blue-black sea, with a heavy dark sky above it, is usually not reckoned among the sights that delight the eye. To our organs of vision, it was a real relief to come into surroundings where dark colors predominated. For months we had been staring at a dazzling sea of white, where artificial means had constantly to be employed to protect the eyes against the excessive flood of light. As a rule, it was even necessary to limit the exposure of the pupils to a minimum and to draw the eyelids together. Now we could once more look upon the world with open eyes, literally without winking. Even such a commonplace thing as this is an experience in one's life. Ross Sea showed itself again on its most favorable side. A cat's paw of southwesterly wind enabled us to use the sails, so that after a lapse of 2 days we were already about 200 miles from the barrier. Modest as this distance may be in itself, when seen on the chart, it looked quite imposing in our eyes. It must be remembered that, with the means of transport we had employed on land, it cost us many a hard day's march to cover a distance of 200 geographical miles. Nilsen had marked on the chart the limits of the belt of drift ice during the 3 passages the Fram had already made. The supposition that an available opening is always to be found in the neighborhood of the 150th meridian appears to be confirmed. The slight changes in the position of the channel were only caused, according to Nilsen's experiences, by variations in the direction of the wind. He had found that it always answered his purpose to turn and try to windward if the pack showed signs of being close. This mode of procedure naturally had the effect of making the course somewhat crooked, but to make up for this it always resulted in his finding open water. On this trip we reached the edge of the pack ice 3 days after leaving the barrier. The position of the belt proved to be very nearly the same as on previous passages. After we had held our course for some hours, however, the ice became so thick that it looked badly for our further progress. Now was the time to try Nilsen's method. The wind, which, by the way, was quite light, came about due west, and accordingly the helm was put to starboard and the bow turned to the west. For a good while we even steered true south, but it proved that this fairly long turn had not been made in vain. After we had worked our way to windward for a few hours, we found openings in numbers. If we had held our course as we began, it is not at all impossible that we should have been delayed for a long time with a free passage a few miles away. After having accomplished this first long term, we escaped having to make any more in future. The ice continued slack, and on February 6 the rapidly increasing swell told us we had done with the Antarctic drift ice for good. I doubt if we saw a single seal during our passage through the ice belt this time, and if we had seen any we should scarcely have allowed time for shooting them. There was plenty of good food both for men and dogs this time, without our having recourse to seal beef. For the dogs we had brought all our remaining store of the excellent dog's pemmican, and that was not a little. Besides this we had a good lot of dried fish. They had fish and pemmican on alternate days. On this diet the animals kept in such splendid condition that, when on arrival at Hobart they had shed most of their rough winter coats, they looked as if they had been in clover for a year. For the 9 of us who had just joined the ship, our comrades on board had brought all the way from Buenos Aires several fat pigs that were now living in luxury in their pen on the after deck. In addition to these, 3 fine sheep's carcasses hung in the workroom. It need scarcely be said that we were fully capable of appreciating these unexpected luxuries. Seal beef, no doubt, had done excellent service, but this did not prevent roast mutton and pork being a welcome change, especially as they came as a complete surprise. I hardly think one of us had counted on the possibility of getting fresh meat before we were back again in civilization. On her arrival at the Bay of Whales there were 11 men on board the Fram, all included. Instead of Couchton and Nodved, who had gone home from Buenos Aires while the ship was there in the autumn of 1911, 3 new men were engaged, namely Halvorsen, Olsen, and Steller. The 2 first named were from Bergen. Steller was a German who had lived several years in Norway and talked Norwegian like a native. All 3 were remarkably efficient and friendly men. It was a pleasure to have any dealing with them. I venture to think that they, too, found themselves at home in our company. They were really only engaged until the Fram called at the first port, but they stayed on board all the way to Buenos Aires and will certainly go with us further still. When the shore party came on board, Lieutenant Prestrud took up his old position as first officer. The others began duty at once. All told, we were now 20 men on board, and after the Fram had sailed for a year rather short-handed, she could now be said to have a full crew again. On this voyage we had no special work outside the usual sea routine, and so long as the weather was fair, we had thus a comparatively quiet life on board. But the hours of watch on deck passed quickly enough, I expect. There was material in plenty for many a long chat now. If we, who came from land, showed a high degree of curiosity about what had been going on in the world, the sea party were at least as eager to have full information of every detail of our year-long stay on the Barrier. One must almost have experienced something similar oneself to be able to form an idea of the hail of questions that is showered upon one on such an occasion. What we landlubbers had to relate has been given in outline in the preceding chapters. Of the news we heard from outside, perhaps nothing interested us so much as the story about how the change in the plan of the expedition had been received at home and abroad. It must have been at least a week before there was any noticeable ebb in the flood of questions and answers. That week went by quickly, perhaps more quickly than we really cared for, since it proved that the Fram was not really able to keep pace with time. The weather remained quite well behaved, but not exactly in the way we wished. We had reckoned that the southeasterly and easterly winds, so frequent around Framheim, would also show themselves out in the Ross Sea, but they entirely forgot to do so. We had little wind, and when there was any, it was, as a rule, a slant from the north, always enough to delay our honest old ship. It was impossible to take any observations for the first 8 days. The sky was continuously overcast. If one occasionally asked the skipper about her position, he usually replied that the only thing that could be said for certain was that we were in the Ross Sea. On February 7, however, according to a fairly good noon observation, we were well to the north of Cape Adare, and therefore beyond the limits of the Antarctic continent. On the way northward, we passed Cape Adare at a distance hardly greater than could have been covered with a good day's sailing, but our desire of making this detour had to give way to the chief consideration: northward, northward as quickly as possible. There is usually plenty of wind in the neighborhood of bold promontories, and Cape Adare is no exception in this respect. It is well known as a center of bad weather. Nor did we slip by without getting a taste of this, but it could not have been more welcome, as it happened the wind was going the same direction as ourselves. 2 days of fresh southeast wind took us comparatively quickly past the Balleny Islands, and on February 9th we could congratulate ourselves on being well out of the South Frigid Zone. It was with joy that we had crossed the Antarctic Circle over a year ago, going south. Perhaps we rejoiced no less in crossing it this time in the opposite direction. In the bustle of getting away from our winter quarters, there had been no time for any celebration of the fortunate reunion of the land and sea parties. As this occasion for festivity had been let slip, we had to look out for another, and we agreed that the day of our passage from the frigid to the temperate zone afforded a very good excuse. The prearranged part of the program was extremely simple. An extra cup of coffee, duly accompanied by punch and cigars and some music on the gramophone. Our worthy gramophone could not offer anything that had the interest of novelty to us 9 who had wintered at Framheim. We knew the whole repertoire pretty well by heart, but the well-known melodies awakened memories of many a pleasant Saturday evening around the toddy table in our cozy winter home down at the head of the Bay of Whales. Memories which we need not be ashamed of recalling. On board the Fram, gramophone music had not been heard since Christmas Eve, 1910, and the members of the sea party were glad enough to encore more than one number. Outside the limits of the program, we were treated to an extra number by a singer who imitated the gramophone and utilizing a big megaphone to make up for the deficiencies of his voice, according to his own statement. He hid behind the curtain of Captain Nilsson's cabin, and through the megaphone came a ditty intended to describe life on the Barrier from its humorous side. It was completely successful, and we again had a laugh that did us good. Performances of this kind, of course, only have a value to those who have taken part in or are acquainted with the events to which they refer. In case any outsider may be interested in seeing what our entertainment was like, a few of the verses are given here. It must be remarked that the author composed his production in the supposition that we would be able to meet by Christmas, and he therefore proposed that for the moment we should imagine ourselves to be celebrating that festival. We made no difficulty about acceding to his request. Well, here we are assembled to jollity once more, some from off the ocean and the rest from off the shore. A year has passed since last we met, and all are safe and sound. Then let us banish all our cares, and join our hands all round. Christmas, happy Christmas! Let us pass the flowing bowl. Fill your glasses all, and let's make sails a wee bit full. For all I'll say is this, that it's in his country's cause. If he staggers just a little, it is in his country's cause. Now you sailor boys shall hear about the time we have gone through. The winter, well, it wasn't long, we had so much to do. There was digging, snow, and sleeping, you can bet we're good at that. And eating, too, no wonder we're all a little fat. We had hot cakes for our breakfast, and hammetek each day, mutton pies, ragouts, and curries, for that is Lindström's way. But all I'll say is this, that 'twas in our country's cause. If we stuffed ourselves with dainties, it was in our country's cause. September came and off we went. That trip was pretty tough. Our compasses all went on strike, they thought it cold enough. The brandy in the captain's flask froze to a lump of ice. We all agreed, both men and dogs, such weather wasn't nice. So back we went to Framheim to thaw our heels and toes. It could not be quite healthy when our feet and fingers froze. But all I say is this, that 'twas in our country's cause, and we did not mind a frostbite when 'twas in our country's cause. The sun came up and warmed us then a little day by day. 5 men went out again and toiled along the southern way. This time they conquered snow and ice, and all the world may hear that Norway's flag flies at the pole. Now, boys, a ringing cheer for him who led them forward through the mountains and the plain, up to the goal they aimed at, and safely back again. But all I'll say is this, that 'twas in his country's cause. If he went through and won the pole, 'twas in his country's cause. It could soon be noticed, one way and another, that we had reached latitudes where existence took a very different aspect from what we had been accustomed to south of the 66th parallel. One welcome change was the rise in temperature. The mercury now climbed well above freezing point, and those individuals on board who were still more or less clad in skins shed the last remnants of their polar garb for a lighter and more convenient costume. Those who waited longest before making the change were the ones who belonged to the shore party. The numerous people who imagine that a long stay in the polar regions makes a man less susceptible of cold than other mortals are completely mistaken. The direct opposite is more likely to be the case. A man who stays some time in a place where the everyday temperature is down in the 50s below zero, or more than that, will not trouble himself greatly about the cold, so long as he has good and serviceable skin clothing. Let the same man, rigged out in civilized clothes, be suddenly put down in the streets of Christiania on a winter day, with 30 or 35 degrees of frost, and the poor fellow's teeth will chatter till they fall out of his mouth. The fact is that on a polar trip one defends oneself effectively against the cold. When one comes back and has to go about with the protection afforded by an overcoat, a stiff collar, and a hard hat, well, then one feels it. A less welcome consequence of the difference in latitude was the darkening of the nights. It may be admitted that continual daylight would be unpleasant in the long run ashore, but aboard ship an everlasting day would certainly be preferred if such a thing could be had. Even if we might now consider that we had done with the principal mass of Antarctic ice, we still had to reckon with its disagreeable outpost, the icebergs. It has already been remarked that a practised lookout man can see the blink on one of the larger bergs a long way off in the dark, but when it is a question of one of the smaller masses of ice, of which only an inconsiderable part rises above the surface, there is no such brightness, and therefore no warning. A little lump like this is just as dangerous as a big berg. You run the same risks in a possible collision of knocking a hole in the bows or carrying away the rigging. In these transitional regions, where the temperature of the water is always very low, the thermometer is a very doubtful guide. The waters in which we were sailing are not yet so well known as to exclude the possibility of meeting with land. Captain Colbeck, who commanded one of the relief ships sent south during Scott's first expedition, came quite unexpectedly upon a little island to the east of Cape Adare. This island was afterwards named after Captain Scott. When Captain Colbeck made his discovery, he was about on the course that has usually been taken by ships whose destination was within the limits of the Ross Sea. There is still a possibility that in going out of one's course, voluntarily or involuntarily, one may find more groups of islands in that part. On the current charts of the South Pacific there are marked several archipelagos and islands, the position of which is not a little doubtful. One of these, Emerald Island, is charted as lying almost directly in the course we had to follow to reach Hobart. Captain Davis, who took Shackleton's ship, the Nimrod, home to England in 1909, sailed, however, right over the point where Emerald Island should be found according to the chart without seeing anything of it. If it exists at all, it is, at any rate, incorrectly charted. In order to avoid its vicinity, and still more in order to get as far as possible to the west before we came into the westerly belt properly. We pressed on as much as we could for one hard week, or perhaps nearer two. But a continual northwest wind seemed for a long time to leave us only two disagreeable possibilities, either of drifting to the eastward or finding ourselves down in the drift ice to the north of Wilkes Land. Those weeks were a very severe trial of patience to the many on board who were burning with eagerness to get ashore with our news and perhaps to hear some in return. When the first 3 weeks of February were past, we were not much more than halfway. With anything like favorable conditions, we ought to have arrived by that time. The optimists always consoled us by saying that sooner or later there would be a change for the better, and at last it came. A good spell of favorable wind took us at a bound well to the westward both of the doubtful Emerald Island and of the authentic Macquarie group to the north of it. It may be mentioned in passing that at the time we went by, the most southerly wireless telegraphy station in the world was located on one of the Macquarie Islands. The installation belonged to Dr. Mawson's Antarctic expedition. Dr. Mawson also took with him apparatus for installing a station on the Antarctic continent itself, but, so far as is known, no connection was accomplished the first year. During this fortunate run, we had come so far to the west that our course to Hobart was rapidly approaching true north. On the other hand, we should have liked to be able to take advantage of the prevailing winds, the westerlies. These vary little from one year to another, and we found them much the same as we had been accustomed to before. Frequent stiff breezes from the northwest, which generally held for about 12 hours and then veered to the west or southwest. So long as the northwester was blowing, there was nothing to do but lie to with shortened sail. When the change of wind came, we made a few hours' progress in the right direction. And this way we crept step by step northward to our destination. It was slow enough, no doubt, but every day the line of our course on the chart grew a little longer, and towards the end of February the distance between us and the southern point of Tasmania had shrunk to very modest dimensions. With the constant heavy westerly swell, the Fram, light as she now was, surpassed herself in rolling, and that is indeed saying a great deal. This rolling brought us a little damage to the rigging, the gaff of the mainsail breaking. However, that affair did not stop us long. The broken spar was quickly replaced by a spare gaff. Our hopes of arriving before the end of February came to naught, and a quarter of March went by before our voyage was at an end. On the afternoon of March 4, we had our first glimpse of land, but as the weather was by no means clear and we had not been able to determine our longitude with certainty for 2 days, we were uncertain which point of Tasmania we had before us. To explain the situation, a short description of the coastline is necessary. The southern angle of Tasmania runs out in 3 promontories. Off the easternmost of these, and only divided from it by a very narrow channel, lies a steep and apparently inaccessible island called Tasman Island. It is, however, accessible, for on the top of it, 900 feet above the sea, stands a lighthouse. The middle promontory is called Tasman Head, and between this and the eastern one we have Storm Bay, which forms the approach to Hobart. There, then, lay our course. The question was, which of the 3 heads we had sighted. This was difficult, or rather impossible, to decide, so indistinct was the outline of the land in the misty air. It was also entirely unknown to us, as not one of us had ever been in this corner of the world. When darkness came on, a heavy rain set in, and without being able to see anything at all, we lay there feeling our way all night. With the appearance of daylight, a fresh southwest wind came and swept away most of the rain, so that we could again make out the land. We decided that what we saw was the middle promontory, Tasman Head, and gaily set our course into Storm Bay, as we thought. With the rapidly strengthening breeze we went spinningly, and the possibility of reaching Hobart in a few hours began to appear as a dead certainty. With this comfortable feeling we had just sat down to the breakfast table in the fore saloon, when the door was pulled open with what seemed unnecessary violence, and the face of the officer of the watch appeared in the doorway. "We're on the wrong side of the head," was the sinister message, and the face disappeared. Goodbye to our pleasant plans, goodbye to our breakfast. All hands went on deck at once, and it was seen only too well that the melancholy information was correct. We had made a mistake in the thick rain. The wind, that had now increased to a stiff breeze, had chased the rain clouds from the top of the hills, and on the point we had taken for Tasman Head we now saw the lighthouse. It was therefore Tasman Island, and instead of being in Storm Bay, we were out in the open Pacific, far to leeward of the infamous headland. There was nothing to be done but beat and attempt to work our way back to windward, although we knew it would be practically labour in vain. The breeze increased to a gale, and instead of making any headway, we had every prospect of drifting well to leeward. That was the usual result of trying to beat with the Fram. Rather annoyed though we were, we set to work to do what could be done, and with every square foot of canvas set, the Fram pitched on her way close hauled. To begin with, it looked as if we held our own more or less, but as the distance from land increased and the wind got more force, our bearings soon showed us that we were going the way the hen kicks. About midday we went about and stood in towards land again. Immediately after came a violent squall which tore the outer jib to ribbons. With that we were also obliged to take in the mainsail, otherwise it would pretty soon have been caught aback, and there would have been further damage to the rigging. With the remaining sails, any further attempt was useless. There was nothing left but to get as close under the lee of land as we could, and try with the help of the engine to hold our own till the weather moderated. How it blew that afternoon! One gust after another came dancing down the slopes of the hills, and tore at the rigging until the whole vessel shook. The feeling on board was, as might be expected, somewhat sultry, and found an outlet in various expressions the reverse of gentle. Wind, weather, fate, and life in general were inveighed against, but this availed little. The peninsula that separated us from Storm Bay still lay there, firm and immovable, and the gale went on as if it was in no hurry to let us get round. The whole day went by, and the greater part of the night, without any change taking place. Not until the morning of the 6th did our prospects begin to improve. The wind became lighter and went more to the south. That was, of course, the way we had to go, but by hugging the shore, where we had perfectly smooth water, we succeeded in working our way down to Tasman Island before darkness fell. The night brought a calm, and that gave us our chance. The engine worked furiously, and a slight favourable current contributed to set us on our way. By dawn of the 7th we were far up Storm Bay, and could at last consider ourselves masters of the situation. It was a sunny day, and our faces shone in rivalry with the sun. All traces of the last 2 days' annoyances had vanished, and soon the Fram, too, began to shine. The white paint on deck had a thorough overhauling with soap and water in strong solution. The Ripple-On was again as fresh as when new. When this had been seen to, the outward appearance of the men also began to undergo a striking change. The Iceland jackets and blanket costumes from Horten gave way to shore clothes of the most varied cut, hauled out after a 2 years' rest. Razors and scissors had made a rich harvest, and sailmaker Ron's fashionable Burberry caps figured on most heads. Even Lindstrom, who up to date had held the position among the land party of being its heaviest, fattest, and blackest member, showed unmistakable signs of having been in close contact with water. Meanwhile, we were nearing a pilot station, and a bustling little motor launch swung alongside. "Want a pilot, Captain?" One positively started at the sound of the first new human voice. Communication with the outer world was again established. The pilot, a brisk, good-humored old man, looked about him in surprise when he came up onto our deck. "I would never have imagined things were so clean and bright on board a polar ship," he said, "nor should I thought from the look of you that you would come from Antarctica. You look as though you had had nothing but a good time." We could assure him of that, but as to the rest, it was not our intention just yet to allow ourselves to be pumped, and the old man could see that. He had no objection to our pumping him, though he had no very great store of news to give us. He had heard nothing of the Terra Nova. On the other hand, he was able to tell us that Dr. Masson's ship, the Aurora, commanded by Captain Davis, might be expected at Hobart any day. They had been looking out for the Fram since the beginning of February, and had given us up long ago. That was a surprise, anyhow. Our guest evidently had no desire to make acquaintance with our cuisine. At any case, he very energetically declined our invitation to breakfast. Presumably he was afraid of being treated to dog's flesh or other similar original dishes. On the other hand, he showed great appreciation of our Norwegian tobacco. He had his handbag pretty nearly full when he left us. Hobart town lies on the bank of the Derwent River, which runs into Storm Bay. The surroundings are beautiful, and the soil evidently extremely fertile, but woods and fields were almost burned up our arrival. A prolonged drought had prevailed, and made an end to all green things. To our eyes it was, however, an unmixed delight to look upon meadows and woods, even if their colours were not absolutely fresh. We were not very difficult to please on that score. The harbour of Hobart is an almost ideal one, large and remarkably well protected. As we approached the town, the usual procession of harbour master, doctor, and custom house officers came aboard. The doctor soon saw that there was no work for his department, and the custom house officers were easily convinced that we had no contraband goods. The anchor was dropped, and we were free to land. I took my cablegram and accompanied the harbour master ashore. End of section 29. End of volume 2, chapter 14, Northward. Recording by Tom Crawford, California, USA, August 2008.